So now that we have our virtual guests here, I just want to give a quick thank you to everyone for joining us. I am Jordanna Gessler, the Vice President of Education and Exhibits at Holocaust Museum LA, and I'm joined by my colleague Christie, our collections manager, who's currently joining us from inside the archive. It is our pleasure to welcome you to this month's Inside the Acid-Free Box program. Our topic today is quite fascinating. It's a behind-the-scenes look at the Edith Flagg Collection. Where would the world be without polyester? Born in Romania on November 1st, 1919, Edith Flagg was a Holocaust survivor, fashion designer, and the first person to import polyester into the United States. Edith spent much of her youth in Vienna attending school and later moved to Holland, which is where she was when the Nazis invaded. She quickly joined other members of the Dutch underground, secured false papers for herself and her son Michael, and helped other Jews evade Nazi capture and deportation. Edith would go on to assume a number of false identities and used connections in the local communities to acquire food and supplies to help others. Today we are joined by two very special guests, Michael Flagg, Edith's son, and museum board member and Edith's grandson, who's also the star of Bravo's $1 Million listing, Josh Flagg. Josh is a devoted and dedicated board member of Holocaust Museum LA and has worked hard for years to preserve his grandmother's legacy of education and to use his voice to further the museum's mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire. Thank you so much for joining us today as we explore the life of this incredibly daring and courageous woman. We will first begin with a quick overview by Christie of the museum's collection and then move forward to hear from Josh and Michael as we explore some of our primary sources.
Hi, thanks, Jordanna. So for any of you who've joined us previously, you will know that within the museum's collection, we have over 20,000 artifacts and documents. Many of the collections relate to a specific person or family and include materials such as photographs, documents, three-dimensional objects such as badges, pins, textiles, and then we also have a selection of oral and written testimony from Holocaust survivors. So this collection in particular relates to Edith Flagg, and it's comprised of photographs, documents, and her own words in her testimony, and spans the period of her life before World War II all the way through to the time that she immigrated to the US post the war. And this is a look at some of the artifacts from the collection. And so this collection is definitely one of our favorites at the museum and very much a unique collection you see there. And we will look at them a little bit closer later on in the talk. The middle documents there are actually some of the fake identity documents that Edith used to work with the Dutch resistance and underground. And as Jordanna mentioned briefly, helping other Jews in hiding, helping smuggling food, and actually under a cover of a Red Cross nurse, she was able to help a number of other people as part of the Dutch resistance. So I think we'll probably jump into the collection if you're ready, Jordanna.
Yes, I wanted to see, Michael, if there are any photographs that you recognize here.
Are you asking me?
Oh no, I asked Michael if there were any documents he wanted to speak about or he recognized, or even Josh, are there any photos or documents that you've heard specific stories about from your grandmother?
Well, I recognize all of them. I mean, let's see. Well, first of all, you know the J stands for Jew, right? Juden. There's several photos here. Well, let's see, starting at clockwise, the 11 o'clock top left is my grandfather, Hans Stein. Stein is our real last name, by the way. It was changed from Stein to Flegenheimer for my grandmother's second husband, and it was changed to Flagg after the war. Can you guys hear me, by the way?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, good. Sorry, the reception's... Oh, good. Followed by that, the one next to that is my grandmother, and then much to that is Eric Flagg. That's to the right. Several of these documents. Well, that's my Okay, so then you see the photo to the far right on the top column is my grandmother milking a cow. The photo right below that is Eric Flegenheimer in the ocean. Now going back the other direction, Eric Flegenheimer's husband too, which is where you get the name Flagg. Hans Stein was husband number one. So now you move back to the left again. That's Edith and Hans Stein. You go down one and you have my, what, Dad? Dad, did you say something? You know, the reception's pretty poor here. I hope you guys can hear me. If you move down one other, you can see my grandmother and my father. Will you call them and ask them if they can hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, good, because I can't hear any of you. Now, if you look to the far right, I believe,
It's a little hard to see, but it is.
man who was, there's a gentleman there, I believe that is a gentleman named Rue Cohen. If that's not Eric Flegenheimer, that's a gentleman named Rue Cohen, was one of the heads of Dutch underground. If you go below, there's my dad again. You then have a soccer team, which was Eric Flagg, followed by, I guess, Eric Flagg and then Eric Flagg.
Yes. So I guess we should start at the very beginning, which is her birth in Vienna in November of 1919. And she and her sister, they were primarily raised in Romania as little girls. Oscar, her father, was a photographer and he ran his studio out of their family home. Edith has remembered a really happy childhood, people always stopping by. Her mother would often cook for the community. And education was really, really important to Oscar and Jenny, Edith's parents. And so they ensured that both of their daughters spoke multiple languages and were really a big part of the culture that they lived in the town. Christy, can you tell us a little bit about these photos?
Yeah, so these are actually photos from Josh's book. And you can see on the left-hand side is a picture of Edith's parents, Oscar and Jenny. And like Jordanna mentioned, Oscar ran a very successful photography studio out of the family's home. And then the photos on the right, the top photo there is of Edith as a young girl in Romania. And then the one underneath that is actually Edith and her sister Martha as children.
Yeah, and there was an incredibly rich culture of Jewish life in Romania. There have historians have found evidence that Jews have lived in Romania since 101 CE. But really the first big waves of Jewish immigration to Romania happened around 1290. And then again, after Jews were expelled from Hungary in 1367, and then again after the Spanish expulsion in the 16th century. So all in all, there was a deep, long history of Jewish life in Romania. And in 1924, so in the interwar period, about 5% of Romania's population was Jewish. But then Edith's parents decided that she should go and live in Vienna with her aunt, and she was able there to finish design school in Vienna. And Christy, can you tell us a little bit about the photographs that we're seeing here and the part of the story we're in now?
Yeah, so some of these photos you see on this page are some that were actually from that first slide that Josh was talking to. So I can maybe, Jordanna, if you want to stop screen sharing for a second, and I can hold them up so that it might be a little bit easier to see. So basically, like Jordanna mentioned, Edith went to Vienna to finish her schooling when she was about 14, and she stayed with her aunt. And during that time, she actually met Hans Stein, who actually became her husband. And so this is a photo of Hans. So the couple actually met through their joint association of a youth Zionist group, and they met on a ski trip. And so this is actually some of the pictures that we have in the PowerPoint are actually on display in our first gallery downstairs, which tells the story of Jewish life before the war in Europe. And this is actually a photo of the couple, obviously a very young photo of them. And so, as I mentioned, they met in a Zionist youth group that they were both members of. And ultimately in 1937, when Edith finished her schooling, Hans was moving to Holland. And so the couple actually, Edith actually followed Hans and relocated to Holland as well.
Michael, did you ever hear any stories from your mother about her life in Vienna before the war?
Mostly going to movies with her sister.
And I'm I'm going back to the PowerPoint. So as Christie mentioned, the couple decided to move to the Netherlands, and Germany invaded the Netherlands on May 10th, 1940. And 4 days later, the Dutch army surrendered. The German occupation of the Netherlands was actually one in which much of the Dutch community and government worked efficiently alongside the Nazis. But in response to that, many
airplane mode.
Many in the country actually joined the resistance, the Dutch resistance, specifically, as we know, Edith Flagg. So Edith and Hans decided to join the Dutch resistance, and they placed Michael in hiding with a false identity as a non-Jewish child, and he's placed in an orphanage. And as Josh had mentioned,
interrupt for a while.
Yeah, please.
I would really love to hear, because there's a story, if we just backpedal just for a second. So when Edith became pregnant with Michael, there was a story in the book and also in her testimony that I'm not sure if Josh or Michael want to talk about, but how she essentially pedaled herself on a bicycle to the hospital to give birth to Michael.
It was a Catholic hospital for the criminally insane.
Wow.
And she pedaled herself to the hospital while pregnant in the middle of a war.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So the hospital was actually a Catholic hospital for criminally insane. She went in, dressed as a Red Cross nurse with a big cane, dropped me off, gave birth, and I was hidden in a drawer. She got back on the bicycle and went back to the war.
That is an unbelievable story. I can't believe I can't even imagine the strength and courage and real resistance that she needed to not just pedal herself on a bicycle 9 months pregnant, but also to trust others with the safety of her child.
Explains why I'm claustrophobic today.
So as Josh mentioned earlier, the J on the identification cards indicate that somebody was Jewish. And so as you can see here, there are clearly documents of the same people. And you can see one document of Edith's with a J on it and one without. And those identify the fake identity cards. And after the Nazi invasion in 1940, they very quickly worked with the Dutch government to begin identifying Jews living within the country and targeting them to be arrested and sent to Westerbork concentration camp and eventually out to Eastern Europe to be killed. And so it was highly, highly important for Jews in the Netherlands to get false identity papers, to change their identity from that of Jewish to that of a non-Jew in order to ensure survival. This oftentimes involved a lot of very tricky negotiating, very risky endeavors in receiving these false identity cards. And if they were ever caught in the process, they were immediately arrested, could be tortured, could be killed on the spot. So it's very important to kind of understand the constant fear and terror that both Jews and non-Jews in the Dutch underground at this time were experiencing, and the psychological trauma of what they were doing, where they were either collecting information about the Nazis, sharing that information, organizing to hide children like Michael, but also hundreds of children throughout the Netherlands, and just to ensure that there was safety. And many non-Jews selflessly helped during this time without asking for money or any sort of personal gain of themselves. And those who helped Jews were in danger of being deported themselves to concentration camps and could face death themselves. And this really large organization of the Dutch underground set up to assist all of the Jews in hiding. And so in total, you know, it's unknown the full numbers, but about 2/3 of the hidden Jews in the Netherlands were able to survive, mostly because of the workings of the underground. Christy, do you want to add? I know you have some artifacts there to show us as well.
Yeah, do you want me to? I can hold them up if you want to unshare for a second. Yeah. We can see them in a bit more closer detail. So these are the documents that Jordanna was just talking about that we were looking at on the PowerPoint. So this is Edith's document, and you can see it has the J that Jordanna and Josh had mentioned, which indicates that she was Jewish. And obviously this card is actually also in her real name, which you might be able to see on this side here. And so that was obviously her real identification card. And then we have other identification cards for her as well, which were her fake identification cards. So this one obviously has a photo of her, which indicates that it's hers, but doesn't have the J. And then also on this card, we can see her false identity that she assumed, which was Lydia. And she was actually under the cover of being a Red Cross nurse. And that allowed her to work with the underground and really move about quite freely and not be suspected of being Jewish.
And in fact, there was a specific division of the Dutch underground that Edith joined, which was the Westerweel resistance group, which was operated by both a Dutch Christian named Westerweel, but also a Jewish German man named Joachim Simon. And this was a group that was initiated in August of 1942. And their first and primary objective was to hide specifically Jewish youth who were probably in their teens and 20s. And the members of this group had been ordered to report to be deported to Westerbork. And this group quickly started hiding them throughout the country. And it was about 450 Jewish teenage boys and girls who were living in the Netherlands as refugees from Austria and Germany. Initially, they had been working on farms, as we saw Edith milking the cow earlier, because they initially had wanted to join the movement and move to Israel, and agriculture was a very important skill to have at that time. And so this was the primary part of the Dutch resistance that Edith joined. And I'm just going to share my screen again. But I know, Josh, you know many, many stories of your grandmother's resistance fighting. And I was wondering if you or your father wanted to share one of the ones that have resonated the most with you.
Well, I wanted to say something. You know, it's such a. I think it's because Christie's in the vault right now, which is why I thought it was our service. I think it's because it's like a cement sealed room or whatever. But I can hear you perfectly, Jordanna. I can't hear anything Christie's saying.
Okay.
I guess I spoke too soon. Now I can't hear you.
Okay, we'll definitely try to see if we can fix that on our end. But I was wondering if there's a story of resistance that that really resonates with you from your grandmother's story, or Michael from your mother's story.
Josh, would you like to tell the story about the sack of potatoes?
Go ahead.
About how she was riding and had guns and ammunition and explosive in her basket when she was Red Cross uniform, and a slow train came by with Wehrmacht German soldiers. So they took her and put her off on the train. Down, and there was a knock on the door, and Eric comes out. He sees that it's a troop of German soldiers. He was going to cross nurse.
They wouldn't give it to you? What was the reason?
Michael, you were a little broken up with that story.
Maybe if the rest of us mute our microphones, it might be a bit easier to hear.
Ask Josh. He knows the story about the potatoes and the train and the German soldiers.
Josh, it sounds like your dad wants you to share the story.
Or, yes, you are. You're busy.
Basically, my grandmother, being disguised as a Christian woman, was needed to move a big, huge thing of potatoes, like a big sack of potatoes, so people could. Thank you. So people could. That's a good pour. So people could eat the potatoes, obviously, but she had to take them from one city to another. And so what she did was, the potatoes were important, but more important was there was a bunch of guns and ammunition that she was really transporting. So in order for the dogs at the border not to suspect anything, smell anything, whatnot, the potatoes and the guns were hid under a big thing of horse manure to block the scent, so they couldn't smell the potatoes. Because why would a Christian woman be smuggling potatoes from one side to the other? Only if you were, trying to feed, poor Jews on the other side. So that's the reason that happened. But of course, she was very brave, and she did that, and that was nothing. I mean, the woman swam in the lake with Nazis in the morning, who, by the way, we'll get to in a second, she killed a few of them. But prior to that, she would swim in the morning with them. They thought she was a Red Cross nurse, and so she would swim, listen to stories, and then report back to the Dutch underground. And it's funny, you're talking about guns and the Nazis. The really interesting was that, I just never asked her because I didn't think she did it. But it wasn't like she was hiding it. But I said to her, "Did you ever kill anyone?" She goes, "What do you think?" And I go, "What do you mean? Who'd you kill?" She goes, "Nazis." I really hope you guys got that story because I can't hear anyone.
I mean, Michael, did your mother ever share these stories with you when you were a kid?
Yeah, she shared quite a few. She was not proud that she had to kill people, but it never stopped her. And if it was a Nazi that was, doing something that she could do something about, she would. She did a lot of transporting of arms and ammunition, and always riding on her bicycle from place to place. And nobody, everybody thought she was a nice German Red Cross nurse.
Yeah. I mean, it's something I think that none of us can truly understand, is the choices that people made in very, very difficult life or death situations. And it sounds like Edith had to make choices for herself and for her child and for her community. And that's exactly what she did. Unfortunately,
she was the Zionist who wanted to go to Palestine.
Right. Unfortunately, during a mission, Hans was captured and deported to Auschwitz, where he was eventually murdered by the Nazis. And after Hans's death, Edith grew close to another resistance member named Eric, who was also part of the same group in the Netherlands. So after the war, Edith and Michael immigrated to the British Mandated Palestine in 1945. As Michael just said, she was a Zionist and really wanted to move to Israel. And they were reunited with Edith's sister, who was living there as well, Martha. And Eric had immigrated to the United States and contacted Edith and invited her to come to the US. And they were reunited in 1947 in New York, and they were married. And so there are a number of adorable photographs here. I'm wondering, Michael, if you can identify some of them for us.
Top left is still in Holland. The one below it is in Afula in Palestine. The one next to it is my Aunt Martha and myself. The one without a shirt on, I think, is 1949, maybe something like that, but is in, I think, in San Francisco. And I can't see the one that's above your head. Oh, it's me. It's in the United States.
Do you have any childhood memories of being in Israel?
I remember when the British turned it over to the Arab Legion. I remember firefights and trucks lorries going by outside by Fula, which is a very small town then. So a lot of that was 1947, I still remember very, very clearly.
And Christie, do you have any documents with you there in the archive?
I mean, I have the photos that you're looking at if you want to take a closer look at them, but I know that there's a story as well. And I don't know, Michael, if you want to talk to it at all, but even, you know, after she left Holland and after she's immigrated to Palestine, you know, obviously the courageous behavior is still continued after that, because she was asked to, when she got to Palestine, she was asked to go back to Holland and bring a child that had been left behind at an orphanage there to Palestine to be reunited with his mother. And as I understand it, Michael, I think because she had documents for you and her to be able to come into the country, she went back and retrieved the child and was able to do that and smuggle him back into the country.
Her documents had her name and with child.
Right.
Did not have my name. So I stayed with my grandparents and my aunt in Afula. She went back to Holland, brought another child about my age back in as child. The child was not allowed to say anything except from mama. Reintroduced the child back to their parents who were in Israel, Palestine. And that was the end of the story, except for something which happened a couple of years ago. One of my cousins was in Israel on a visit, and she's watching television, and a man on television says he's a retired police captain or something. And he says the only regret he has in life is that he never knew, and he told the story about being brought as a child from Holland to Palestine. And his only regret was he never got to find out who this was that risked herself and went back again and brought him in. And that was until 2018. He did not know who it was. And then my cousin got in touch with him. And of course, now he knows who it was. But it was just by accident, 65 years afterwards, that he found out.
That's incredible.
You know, I've been off for a couple of minutes because of the reception here. Which story was this? I heard something. What was this 65 years later?
Rivka saw the policeman on television talking about the woman that brought him back in.
I know the story. Great story. By the way, guys, if you're wondering why I keep going in and out, it's because I am in the middle of North Carolina at the Biltmore Estate, which, if anybody knows what that is, that's the biggest house in America. It's the Vanderbilt property in Asheville, North Carolina. And as fabulous as the house is, their Wi-Fi sucks. So when Mr. Vanderbilt built it, he should have considered that.
I completely agree. So, I mean, now we want to talk a little bit more about life in America and Edith creating Edith Flagg Inc. And I'm wondering, Michael and Josh, if you can speak to this a little bit about how she created this incredible fashion company and how she went from a survivor to a businesswoman.
That's all going to be my dad because he lived it and I didn't. Unfortunately, I could have helped you with the other things, but I guess we were interrupted by all the trees around this 26,000 acre property. So Dad, you can take it.
Well, she started off making costumes for women of ill repute and dancers in Las Vegas and things like that. It was a job. She worked for Magnin a little bit. She went from San Francisco to get together with my stepfather. We'll refer to him as my father from now on. I was living in San Francisco in a one-room, slept in the kitchen, in a one-room apartment in San Francisco. My mother went to Los Angeles. And in the early 50s, they started a dress company with another couple and bought them out a few years later. And she went with Eric to England, to London, to buy some fabric. And she was introduced there to something from a company called ICI, International Chemical, who were using polyester for as a replacement for silk in parachutes and starting in also in underwear. So she had them knit up for them some thicker variations of it, and it was called crimpline in England, and it was called Dialen in Germany, and they imported, took all their money, and they bought all these different samples of this fabric to the United States and started making dresses out of them. And there wasn't such a thing. To give you an example, in 1961, it was summer vacation. I went on the road as a salesman to Texas, and I would go to stores in, these small towns to show them what we had, and they were interested in pastel wool dresses. And I told them about polyester and crimpline, and they said, well, is anybody else in town bought them? I said, no, I would go to the horse trough that was in front of some of these stores, and I would take the dress and dip it in the water and wring it out and slap it on. It was the biggest fight ever to get anybody to take a chance on a fabric that was not a natural fiber. Today, it's hard to find natural fiber. And it grew.
Thank you for sharing that. It sounds like you were the first employee of Edith Flagg Inc.
No, it's just we had a lot of old salesmen that died, and during the vacation, I was the one that was sent always to take their place.
I know, Josh, that you missed a little bit of her Holocaust and post-Holocaust experience. There is going to be a Q&A, so if you're watching, please put your questions in the Q&A. I know that we want to have the opportunity to ask Michael and Josh all of our questions. And Josh, I'll give you the heads up to think about sort of, what legacy do you feel that your grandmother has left you? And while you start considering that answer, I do want to share a quick film that I know you put together in honor of your grandmother. And I think that this will really, speak to the connection that the two of you had, and also what her legacy meant for you, and sort of why you are so inspired to be involved in Holocaust education and remembrance. So let me just quickly share this video.
I had a unique relationship with my grandmother. Most kids, when they're growing up, want to hang out with people their own age, which makes sense, or do normal things like play football and eat pizza and whatever. For me, a fun evening would be going to the Bel Air Hotel with my grandmother. Most kids don't like that kind of stuff. I like to sit there and listen to music with her. We'd listen to the piano player. That was kind of when we had a very unique relationship. My grandmother ran the show. What do you think of my jacket?
I don't like that jacket. I don't know what that is, where you have to have your stomach hanging out.
It's a My Les Miserables jacket.
It is Les Miserables, that's for sure. Forget about it. Send it back.
Send it back, I can't. Okay.
Get a return on that. Just wear something where you cover up your stomach.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
That's a horrendous thing.
Well, thank you. All right, so I say goodnight.
Bye-bye. Kiss the ring.
Since we were essentially best friends, we traveled the world together. We went to probably 70 countries together. So, and every trip that we took, I would always remember, she'd say, if we went to Paris, she'd say, this is not a shopping trip. This is an educational trip. She'd go, shopping you can do in Beverly Hills, but you can't go see historical sites like this. And so she was always wanting to educate me. That was really her more important, that was really her purpose. So I really had I was very lucky, because most kids don't get to do these kind of things. Very few, actually. Growing up, you hear stories all the time when she's in the car with you and her sister, or when you're at home at the dinner table with her, you're always hearing stories and educational stories and things that stick with you.
I have to tell you something which I never told anybody.
What is that?
You asked me once if I shot or if I used a gun. And I said to you, yes.
What do you mean? Who did you kill?
I'm not going to tell you who I killed, but I killed.
A Nazi?
Of course.
You shot a Nazi?
I shot self-defense. I shot somebody that shot others that I They had no reason to shoot them. I was hiding behind the bushes to see till they were set up. And when they were completely set up and ready, bim, bim, boom, that's it. And then they died.
Were you by yourself?
Always by yourself, the best way. And don't open your big mouth.
Where'd you get the gun?
The Germans gave me a gun. What do you mean, where is the gun? I was part of the underground forces.
I know.
When this thing started, I went on my bicycle and I made a vow right then and there. What I'm going to do. You or me, right? Now who is going to come first? You or somebody else?
You know.
You have to be dangerous.
Dangerous.
A very dangerous.
Don't mess with me.
Absolutely, very dangerous person.
Sometimes I find myself talking and I'm like, what did I just say? I will almost say something that doesn't even sound like English. It's like a combination of Romanian, German, French. Her shtick, like I've kind of become her, which is bizarre. I'm a little taller, but my grandmother was very blunt. One time I think a golfer said to her, "Where's Romania?" And she goes, "Get a globe." Just whatever came out of her head, she spoke.
The clothes today, it's always the tits.
Excuse me?
The tits. When a woman wants to get dressed, she doesn't cover herself completely. The tits have to come out someplace.
What are you talking about? But she was the nicest person. She'd go to Hillcrest Country Club. I'd say, "What are you doing today?" She's going, "I'm going to have lunch." I go, "Who are you having lunch with?" She goes, "The waiters." I go, "What do you mean?" She goes, "Well, I don't really like the people at the club, so I just, I brought them some Romanian eggplant. We sat in the kitchen, we talked. I cooked a little bit with them." That's how my grandmother was. I just wish that I turned out that way, but we can, sometimes you skip a generation. Sometimes I feel like I'm getting messages from her. I don't believe in spirits and this and that or whatever, but everywhere I go, it's like she was talking to me. Like, we have a document that we found in the vault upstairs. She left messages to me after she died. Like, I've looked at this document. I was in the vault upstairs. We opened up documents that she donated to the museum. And the first line, it says, "Joshua, this is an oral history of your family for you." I never even saw this before, and it's in the Holocaust Museum upstairs, which is very cool. So I'm lucky that I have a pretty large platform to spread Holocaust awareness. What do I mean by that? I've been fortunate enough to have a show on television. What I try to bring, though, to that show is elements outside of real estate, which is what I do. I try to bring awareness to other things, even such as the Holocaust. What do I mean? My grandmother was alive and was a regular on that television show. And what we loved, and what America or any country in the world that watched that show loved, their favorite thing was always my grandmother. I'm actually listing another unit for sale on the 17th floor, right across the hall from me.
Oh, a new floor.
Yeah, it's $2 million, it's 1,700 square feet, and it's got a beautiful view.
So I'll tell you what, let's go and take a look.
What do you think?
Very interesting, very artistic.
Very nice decor, huh?
Let me see how those chairs are. To do this.
So you're comfortable.
Oh, fantastic, they're big enough I can sleep in here.
You probably could sleep in that thing. Every day I receive emails, Instagram messages, whatnot, and I would say 50% of them say, "We loved your grandma, that's the only reason we watched the show," or "We tuned in for this." And obviously, you watch clips of it, you'll see she was an amazing individual that gave so much knowledge and so much wisdom, but in almost a comedical way. She almost found, like, in everything, she found humor in everything. I'll say things,
I just want to stop there because I think, I want to give time for both Josh and Michael to speak to this character we just learned so much about, both her stories of killing Nazis, rescuing Jews, saving herself, her child during a time that's unimaginable and inhumane, and finding humanity to do the right thing during that time, to traveling, bringing this little boy to his parents in Israel, coming to the US and starting this incredible company, and going on to be a wonderful mentor for you, Josh. And it sounds as if always having a sense of humor for everything. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, Josh.
Well, I wanted to say that I missed half of the interview because of the reception, and I finally moved into a better place. That's one of the only things I saw. But yeah, everything I said in that video is true. She was a remarkable woman. If you think about it, most of the people that survived the war didn't want to talk about it. It was like something that you just didn't talk about. It was a horrible time. If you met my grandmother, I don't care whether if it was on Rodeo Drive or Century City Mall or at the Apple Pan, within 4 seconds, she would tell you about the war, which was the weirdest thing ever. Because really, honestly, Holocaust survivors really just didn't talk about it because they were just, it was such a dark time, they want to relive it. But for some reason, the woman found it just didn't faze her, and she was just like a remarkable woman. And the irony was that she had such a good sense of humor. She could twist it. You know, today we're so PC and we're so sensitive about things you could talk about. She would make jokes about the Holocaust all the time. And by the way, she could do whatever she wanted because she was there. I'm not saying that, you know, there's like, I could make a joke or anything like that, but she could make a joke. She could say whatever she wanted because she could find humor or something great to talk about, or the positivity of anything. I don't mean positivity like, you know, there's anything positive with the holiday, but she just had a great sense of humor, a great spirit, really didn't give, you know, anything about what anyone thought about her. And, you know, whatever she ever did, was never her name on a building. It was never like a name, like whatever, you know. I've looked at the return. I know what the kind of money that she donated over time to different charities, whatever. It was never in her name or anything. I mean, my grandfather, ironically, was the one that was much more loved, like, you know, the charity events in his name and honoring Edith and Eric Flagg, whatever. My grandmother could care less, and she was really totally different human being than my grandfather, who was obviously amazing. He was in the Dutch underground, but at the end of the day, my grandmother was really the power force in that relationship. I'll let my dad take over from there.
When Josh says could make jokes, he's not saying jokes about the Holocaust, but Josh is actually jokes about the war. Like, for example, when the Germans started bombing Holland, my father was sleeping and everybody said, wake up, the Germans are bombing us. And he would just say, leave me alone, I'm going back to sleep. In an hour, the war was still beyond. So it's not a joke about the Holocaust, it's just a joke of life, what life was like in those days.
We have a question from the audience about how Edith was reunited with Michael when the war was over.
We were never separated.
So we were only separated, we were separated twice. We were separated when she went back to Holland. And we were separated once we came to the United States. We came by ship to New Jersey. And then with $5 in her pocket, which was worth more than $5 today, we took the train to San Francisco, where I slept in the kitchen. And she had to go design stuff. She moved to Los Angeles to be with Eric. I stayed for a couple of years in San Francisco with Hans's parents. And then after 2 years, I came down by train and started living with my mother and Eric in a very tiny little place in Los Angeles.
We have another question from the audience on how did Edith's sister, Martha, survive? Or what was her journey?
Martha and her parents left Romania in the mid-30s. They immigrated to Palestine. So they were already living there at the time. Bubi, who was Martha's and my mother's father, was in charge of all the roads in that part of Palestine, having them built as a road builder. And so they had already been living for over 10 years, 12 years actually, in Palestine when we got.
And I know, so there's a question from the audience about if there's a book written by Edith Flagg. And Josh, I know that you wrote a book about your grandmother, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that experience.
Well, you know, the interesting thing is my grandmother was so unpretentious. She never cared. She didn't want people to know about her story. Like, she didn't brag about it, but she would tell you in 5 seconds if you were just like human to human, whatever. Loved to talk about it, but had no desire to make a movie or this or that, whatever. In fact, one time she told me she was on the golf course at Hillcrest and she was playing golf with Cubby Broccoli. And Cubby Broccoli was the guy who did James Bond in 007. He wrote all the whatever not. And he wanted to do a movie. She goes, I don't need this shit. Basically, whatever. So, finally, after a while, I was like, after my grandfather died, I kind of took over for him in like 99. And we just started, my grandmother and I just hung out all the time. And I go, let's just do this shit. And I started with tape recordings that she started in like 1971 or 72. She would stay up at night, and that's remarkable. I have these photos. In fact, I'm sending them to the museum to have them redigitized. But and I have the original tape recorder. It's really interesting. She's in like 1971. I said, sitting in her place on the 30th floor of the Sierra Towers, recording these videos, telling her story. And it's really interesting because her voice doesn't even sound like her, because it was so many years earlier. It sounds like a younger person's voice, which I always found very interesting. So I started using that and then obviously going through stories with her, interviewing her. And by the time I was 14, we had a done book.
And so where can guests find the book today?
You can go Amazon, you can go wherever you want, or you can just come to the museum and just buy it there, which I'd prefer.
And it's called The Simple Girl.
Yeah. I don't know why. I just came up with it one night because she was really simple. She was a titan in the industry. My grandmother was really I would say in the 70s and 80s, if you ask anybody that was a sportswear manufacturer of women's clothing or anybody that, she was really respected.
When she,
yeah.
Times Square, they had her up in light the day she died, with her date of birth and the date of that she died, the picture of her in Times Square.
When the NASDAQ closed. Because what she was honest. You know what? It's funny. There were a lot of people that made a lot of money and were wealthy, clothing manufacturers, and did a lot of things. But she had people respected her because not only coming to this country and with $1 in their pocket, but she was so non-bullshit. If you shook her hand, that woman had the strongest handshake of anyone I've ever met. It could crack your knuckles. She was definitely, we hold this for a second. She was definitely, you didn't mess with this woman, and people respected her because she was literally 4 foot, 9 foot tall, and such a force of nature. I'm gonna ask my mom. Mom, what are your memories of Edith? Because tell me about the first time you met her.
The first time I met her, I was very nervous to meet her. And actually, the first time I met her, I went downtown. I was doing something in the Superior Court. And I walked in, I was very nervous about what I was wearing and everything like that. And I walked in, and she wasn't in the main offices. She was in the shipping room, and she was on the ground with Ernie. You probably don't know who that is, Josh. But she was on the ground. Ernie. And she was just doing whatnot. And she looked at me and she said, in her accent, I'm not going to do. Hello. She was kind of a little distant with me because she didn't know if I was going to be sticking around. Because Michael had all these girlfriends. And I remember thinking, yes, you're right, Josh. She was really well respected. And I did respect her. She was a tough, interesting woman. Very interesting.
And then what about the story when you first met her at Hillcrest? Oh, I thought that was the first time you met her.
First time I met her. Yeah.
That was her mother and your grandmother discussing your father and your mother's future.
And we went to
dates.
We went to an art gallery that my dad was involved in. He was, he did paintings, whatever. And at Hillcrest, they had an art show. So that was the first time I met Eric. I met Eric and Edith together. And Eric was really, checking me out, deciding whether I was worthy of being in the family.
No, he was checking you out because he was checking you out.
Let's be honest.
I don't know about that. But anyway, they were really.
I think it's important, Josh, that you should bring out that these 70 countries that you went to with my mother, that the majority of them, the only reason you were able to go was that your father had to stay behind and work.
But you forgot to mention, Mom, that the story when I thought you met Edith the first time at Hillcrest when she came by the table and Dana, my sister, was drawing under the table and do you remember that?
No.
Yes.
No, what really, my mom, Margie Platt, and Edith they weren't really close friends or anything like that. They were acquaintances at Hillcrest.
In fact, they didn't really like each other, but let's be honest.
So one day, Edith and Margie, that's my mom, were talking, and Edith said, well, I have a son. And my mom said, well, I have a daughter. So they put this together and they decided that Michael should call me, and they basically set us up. And that's how it happened.
You're missing the funny part, though. You're missing the funny part when she came over to the table and inspected you.
That's true, she did. She came
That
over.
was another.
But that was another time.
You're right, Josh.
2 different times.
This is the second time in Christie where you were there. Dana was on the floor drawing and spelling elephant.
Under the table.
You were there. My mother came up and you were sitting with your mother and Dana. And she came and that's when she inspected you.
Right.
I looked her up and down to make sure that she was adequate for my father. And when I say up and down, like literally took measurements of her bust, everything.
And I had no desire to go out with you.
And I had no desire to go out with him. But the first time was when my mother and Edith got together and they planned the whole thing.
So it sounds like she's the opposite of a simple girl, Josh, which is the title you picked for your book.
No, she was very simple because she went there, she was like right to the point. Let me check out the inventory. Okay, good, date my son. My grandmother, my mom's mom, Margie, who was also at Hillcrest, was a glamorous woman who always dressed to the nines, like through parties, was totally the opposite. And that's why they kind of didn't get along with each other.
I wouldn't say it was that way. Just because I went out of town once and she came over to my apartment and there was a young lady who was living with me at the time and my mother didn't approve of her. He told the young lady, I got you an apartment. I don't think you're going to be happy here. I think you should move. I came back home to an empty apartment.
That was Edith.
So we have a question from the audience. In your opinion, what do you think Edith felt was her greatest accomplishment?
You know what? I honestly, I don't think she thought of it that way. If someone said she was a hero, she goes, "I'm not a hero. I did what I needed to do." But she would say always, she would go, "You know what? I'm honest. I'm straight to the point. I don't care what you think of me. I'll tell you what's, I will be there for you if you need something. I don't care if you're poor, if you're rich, or whatever." Like she always told me, she was like, it's really funny. She said one time Monty Hall and his wife, they were sitting at Hillcrest at the table and they were just, my grandmother went by and Monty Hall's wife said something like, "Oh, Romania, I heard the food is great." So my grandmother went, "Oh, okay." So she went home, cooked a meal, whatever for her, took it back to Hillcrest, put it in the refrigerator for Monty Hall's wife to, try it the next day at Hillcrest. The woman never even came and even tasted it. Or even the Hollywood Bowl. Remember with Dad, remember with Elon, my grandparents had a box at the Hollywood Bowl and my uncle came with her. This is so funny. My grandmother used to take Chasen's out and cook literally at the Hollywood Bowl, crepe Suzettes and whatnot. Nobody did that. This is the weirdest thing ever. And one day a cousin, a very remote cousin, came over and said, "Hello, Mrs. Flagg, blah, blah, blah." And my uncle said, "Oh my God, he's so nice." They said, "We'll have dinner in the future and this and that." And my grandmother turns to him and goes, "You'll never see him again, please. They're such a phony baloney."
Very true.
So just kind of some last questions is, when did you realize, Josh, that your grandmother was not only a Holocaust survivor, but had been part of the resistance movement in the Netherlands?
Oh my God, when I was like 4, I mean, I told you, everything she ever said to anybody, the first thing, excuse me, I haven't, my nose. The first thing she would ever say to I love telling you, like since I was a child, everything was always started with the war, but it was never like a sad, depressing story. It was always educational.
And so just before we wrap up, are there any final thoughts that you would want to share with the audience, both Michael and Josh, on your mother and grandmother, and what do you think people can do to fulfill her mission and her vision of what the community and world would look like?
Lived every day to the fullest. My mother had a good life. And when Eric died back in the last century, there was nothing that made her happier than travel.
With Josh.
And Josh was the perfect person for her to live each day and to educate him on what was going on in the world. And it made us very happy for him. We didn't have to spoil him one bit. We had somebody else do it for us.
Josh, do you have any final words about your grandmother?
She was just honestly the most remarkable woman. I mean, she was just, I would go with her, I mean, at some place, I'll never forget, one time we went in, I was walking in the pole lounge with her, I go, Grandma, you're wearing sneakers, you can't do that. And she goes, shut up, she'll take my money. They don't care, they take my money, it's good anywhere. Or she went to the Ritz Hotel one time in Paris, and they put her in a room that was not that great. And as they pull her up to the room, she goes, are you kidding me? This piece of shit room. Sorry, I'm swearing, but she goes, I can spread my hands out, one hand to the right and one hand to the left, and I can touch the walls. Give me the suite in the hotel. And she was so aggressive, or not aggressive, but so forceful, or, her strength, she was so small and whatever, that people were like scared of her. She was a scary woman. I mean, honestly, people sometimes, I've heard stories that like, people would come up to the factory and talk to her, and they would try to negotiate with her and whatnot. And she'd say, stop it. You can't, I beat the Nazis and I can beat you too. That was her line. I beat the Nazis and I'll beat you too. Literally.
The doorman tried to stop her because of the way she was dressed. He was in a taxi going from the airport from Cannes to Nice, and the cab driver was complaining about Americans. He let him have it in French, just tore him up and said, if it wasn't for the Americans, you wouldn't be driving this cab here. You wouldn't be.
And she got out of the cab and walked to Hotel du Cap. I swear to God.
The way she was.
It's like she's she was a force to be reckoned with. And I really thank you, Josh, and you, Michael, for joining us and sharing more about her life and just giving true testimony to this courageous and incredible human being and taking us beyond the primary sources and artifacts. So thank you so much for joining us. And before we sign off, I want to invite everyone to join us again for our next Inside the Acid Free Box program, which will take place on Tuesday, December 15th. It will focus on the Kindertransport in honor of Kindertransport Day on December 1st. In the meantime, please join us for one of our upcoming programs on Thursday, November 19th at 11 a.m. Pacific. Join us for a discussion with Holocaust survivor Gabrielle Kieran, who just turned 90 yesterday and published her memoir, Trauma, Memory, and the Art of Survival. And on Tuesday, December 1st at 11 a.m., join us as we commemorate World Kindertransport Day with a discussion with Museum Board Chair Michelle Gold, daughter of a Kindertransport survivor, Paul Kester, who traveled from Germany to Sweden on a Kindertransport in 1939, and Barbara Winton, the daughter of rescuer Sir Nicholas Winton, who died in 2015 at the age of 106 and rescued over 600 children during the Holocaust. You can find more information about our virtual events on our website, holocaustmuseum.org. Thank you again for joining us today. Take care, and we hope to see you again soon.